Alright, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was these two, and I can imagine some people maybe getting bent out of shape in regards to, like, doing a versus with Margin Call and not having the other movie be The Big Short. As far as that goes, number one, during the 2015 award season, we kind of already talked about The Big Short ad nauseum, so that's basically been taken care of as far as I'm concerned. And I feel like as far as these two feel much more sort of character driven to me, whereas The Big Short does have quite a few memorable characters in it, but it does also feel like it's more kind of about the mechanics of it, and kind of getting the audience to understand what, in Margin Call especially, the dialogue is just kind of able to tell the story itself through the characters without having to kind of over-explain what exactly is going on. So, and to see how, like, it affects, actual individual people and kind of explores the humanity or lack of humanity in the movie's individual characters is something that's more interesting to me. And as far as, I guess also you could argue that this might be an odd pairing because the stakes are significantly higher in one movie over the other, where with Glengarry Glen Ross it's just, a few down-on-their-luck salesmen, and in Margin Call it's everybody. But like I said, as far as the humanity of the individual characters and still seeing the impact through them is something that I kind of want to go into as we go through this. I also think it's especially interesting that these two, I feel, are pretty comparable because one is coming from a debut writer-director, and the other one is the film adaptation adapted by the writer himself, who is probably one of the more legendary writers of dialogue in general. And that this, not only did he win, a Pulitzer Prize for this, but the fact that it's David Mamet, and David Mamet basically is so legendary, his writing might as well be its own language. Like the David Mamet story that always gets to me, that kind of shows the sort of how, people have positions in Hollywood that they really shouldn't. Something that we're going to kind of explore, especially in Margin Call, where it's like people having the positions of power, whether they're qualified or not, or seem to be qualified or not. The idea of this story that Paul Thomas Anderson apparently submitted a David Mamet script to a writing class or a film class, and the professor, whoever, gave him a C on it. And the idea that, number one, if somebody hands you a David Mamet script, even if it's not a well-known one, like I said, his writing is so its own language. It's insane to me that somebody in some position of power, or in some position of power as far as writing or creativity, would not recognize it. And just on top of that in itself, giving David Mamet a C just shows how just something is way off here in regards to that. So, yeah, obviously, that pitted up against a debut writer-director is something really interesting to me, and how these movies could potentially be on par with each other is wild. So that's basically why I put these two together. I guess where I want to start is the two characters that kind of symbolize the old being pushed out by the new, or the old being seen as obsolete now, where we have the Jack Lemmon character in Glengarry Glen Ross and Stanley Tucci's character in Margin Call, where I guess to start off with Lemmon's character, where he's the guy that was the big top salesman at one point. And now, I'm not saying that Roma's the new and the young or anything. He has his own sort of veteran status. But he's just kind of a different style. He's a different type of salesman than it feels like Shelley ever was. And you can just kind of see the dynamic shifting, where it's one's on his way to the top and one is on his way, not just down from the top, but kind of out completely in this really depressing way. And so, what I love about Lemmon's performance in this especially is the way he portrays the salesman in that sense of it's two different people when he's trying to sell something when he's on the phone versus when he's just, being himself, being a normal human being in life. And so when we see him on the phone, he's putting on a full performance. He's putting on basically a one-man show when he's on the phone. And it's when you look at all the pieces of this performance, it's almost kind of shocking that he wasn't the one that got an Oscar nomination for this, and that it was Pacino. it's kind of telling of what we're talking about also. But yeah, somebody with Lemon's veteran status playing a character this, with so many layers to him and so many different things going on, and making him so sympathetic also. You would think would have been a slam dunk as far as nominations go, but Pacino. This was also the year Pacino won for Son of a Woman, so it's probably just the whole banner year thing. But yeah, that always stood out to me. That Lemon is definitely feels like probably the standout of the cast to me, and this is obviously an incredible cast that's just completely at the top of their game. You can say that across both movies, but the way he plays the desperation also, where it is to my understanding that Mamet added stuff to the movie script that wasn't in the play that kind of made it a bit more explicit of what's going on in Shelley's life about his daughter being sick and needing doctors and stuff like that, and how it does give Shelley this other sort of side that where we really feel his desperation even more potently, and it makes everything that happens to him all the more sad as it goes on. And something where a really key scene with Shelley also, it almost kind of feels like a turning point when we know the events that eventually play out, is this scene in the car with Williamson, where when he starts off, it's like he's trying to use his salesman tactics. He's trying to sort of fast talk to Williamson about, getting. He's making like this fast talking deal about getting, a hold of the leads before anybody else and getting rid of his, dead options and stuff like that. And then this tactic sort of eventually turns into anger, and he goes into the whole thing of, back in the day I could have gone to Mitch and Murray and had you fired immediately, and because I had that kind of power, I had that kind of pull. And then once he's done flexing that and realizes it's not working, you can see him about to cry, and that's not like another tactic. It's not some manipulation thing. Shell is just really breaking at this point, and it's like I said, all these things are basically coming out in desperation. Or it's almost like he's even coming to terms with the idea of just kind of not having what he once had, not having the skill that he once had as a salesman. How it's not working with any of these dead leads, but it's also it's not working on Williamson either, and it's like just everything he tries to do to sell himself now is just falling short, and you can just see how it's tearing apart. Not to mention the fact that, like I said, his daughter's health seems to kind of hinge on this. And then it's like watching him go through the stages of grief as he finally eventually submits to Williamson and says, fine, fuck it, I'll just deal with what I have. And then to watch him go and try his old tactics, because he does have this very sort of 1950s car salesman way about him. So we get this really painful scene where he goes to Bruce Altman's house and tries to sell him. And like I said, he's using that old style, and it's like, when you see this now, it's like, in the internet age, I guess, I mean, even before the internet age, but kind of especially in this age, people are like more prone now to avoiding people who talk like salesmen and act like salesmen, and it's like to this point to where if this was made now, Shelley wouldn't have even gotten into his house. He may not have even gotten to the house, let alone inside the house. And to just watch these old tactics just fail him over and over again, and realize that he's basically at the end of his run, it's just really sad, and like, as sad as it is, it's also pathetic in a way. That's just really hard to watch, and the way Lemon plays that so perfectly, where he's able to, you definitely get the vibe that he was somebody who really he was the Roma of his time at one point, and now this is what it's come to. And I think when you talk about comparing him to Roma, as far as Roma kind of being the sort of new style of salesmanship, where it's this completely different, like when we see him making the deal with Jonathan Pryce in the restaurant, there's a cut that shows us back to back the differences, where it's Lemon on the phone in the phone booth, and he's doing his whole thing. He's playing up the show. He's pretending that he's busy, that he's getting ready to get on a flight, and doing those old tactics. And then we just get a cut, and it cuts to Pacino talking to Jonathan Pryce, and his first selling line is, "All train compartments smell vaguely of shit." And it's like, you can just tell immediately this is a style that's way different than what Lemon's used to doing, and just the place that Lemon comes from. And so, as we watch this play out, and we see that, we do get this moment towards the end where these two things come together, where Shelley thinks he's made his really big sale, and he and Roma just kind of sit here together, and we see the new and the old kind of, live in harmony here for a second. Now, of course, there is a really sad sort of undertone to this if we already know the events, where we know that this sale is not legit, and we know that Shelley's about to get caught for the break-in. And so this moment with Roma, where we're watching the old meet the new, and what's essentially pushing him out, this may very well be the last triumph of his life, is this moment with Roma, where he thinks he's made this big sale, and saved everything. And then, like I said, the fact that we know that's going to go so downhill really just further solidifies how the past is the past at this point, and people like Shelley are the past now. And it's like, and what's great about this, though, is, and it feels kind of telling also about the vicious circle of this, is that when we see Roma and we see that, he's got his more manipulative tactics, he's more kind of cutthroat, we get moments where he's cool and calculating until he's not. At first it's like, he just wants his car. And that's where it starts, and then as it goes on, and things start to get much more heated, and we start to see Roma kind of reach a breaking point. Something it seems like he may not have been capable of. Even in these moments where things are getting in this shitty sort of area, this shitstorm sort of area that's brewing, he's still fast talking even in these moments where it's like it's just something that's inherently in him. In a way where you think like, oh, he may never lose this. He dresses down Ed Harris and everything, and you can just get this sense of power. But once Williamson fucks up this deal with Jonathan Pryce, and he goes after Williamson, we get a full echo of that dialogue that Williamson had earlier with Shelley, where Shelley said, I could go to Mitch and Murray and have you fired because I have that power. And it's like to see that that moment basically solidifies that at some point Roma will be what Shelley is now. And people like Williamson will just be these pillars that stay, and just kind of their position will always be safe no matter what. And so to kind of see that come full circle, I feel like is really telling about just the cutthroat nature of this whole thing, and the, there's no sort of, the whole idea of the George Carlin bit where it's the people are fucked but the world will keep spinning, and it's like that's basically this salesman world where people will have ups and then people will go down and go into obscurity, disappear, potentially have their lives ruined, but this business will just keep turning. And so looking at that from that standpoint, and looking at what we have going on with Stanley Tucci and Margin Call, where we have this moment that's very real, where he's brought into the office and he's being told that he's being let go. It reminds me of the great scenes in Up in the Air, where Clooney and Anna Kendrick have to go around sort of firing people, and we see the different reactions and how just life-altering and potentially life-ruining these moments are, that are these fleeting moments to these higher-ups in these suits. And it's like, it doesn't matter how long you've been doing this, it doesn't matter how good you are at it, eventually it just comes to a stop because business, essentially. And oftentimes it's just chalked up to bad luck. Shelley talks about that, about how bad luck doesn't come in these fleeting moments. Bad luck comes in strings that just as it rains, when it rains it pours, and it just becomes nonstop. And this is basically what they're trying to chalk it up to. And what's great about this is watching Tucci's performance and how he's doing, where we talked about how Shelley kind of becomes more pathetic in his desperation. Eric, the Tucci character, is doing everything he can, clearly, to keep his dignity. Where it's as he's, getting all this, he's, quietly taking the blows. There's a very subtle intensity going on here, as he's being told, not only are you being let go, but, we're going to cut off everything, and you have to make your decision in, 24 hours, or you're essentially fucked. And you can just see all of this setting in, but the great thing it's a terrible thing, but from a movie standpoint, a writing standpoint, and an acting standpoint, it's fantastic, is that when you see what Eric is going through in this moment, it's not just the uncertainty about his life. Like with Shelley, and it's like it's not just his life, but it's his daughter's life, and that's a big stake in itself. Like I said, for the individual person. But when you look at what Eric has here, not only is it the uncertainty about his own life, like what's he going to tell his wife, are his kids going to be okay? It's what's going to happen about the bigger picture. What Eric knows that nobody else knows yet at this point, and that he's got that weight on him on top of this also. And to kind of have those things going back and forth between, oh, my wife and kids, oh, literally everybody else, and how that builds up, and like I said, the idea of the character being able to try to keep his dignity, where this opening scene obviously culminates in him yelling "fuck you" at Demi Moore and smashing his phone, where it's like that seems like a small reaction with what all is on this guy's shoulders. And so I love this moment later when Paul Bettany finally does track him down and they're sitting outside on the steps. And when you see this dignity coming through, where he talks about building the bridge, and he's essentially summing up where it's not just his... That's the thing, too, is talking about, his worth to the individual people, as well as everything as a whole. This idea of self-worth also comes into play, because when he talks about this bridge, he's talking about his worth to people, essentially, like all the hours he saved these people. But as he's doing this, and he's talking about all these numbers about how this is the number of minutes and hours and days that people have saved, and years that people have saved because of this bridge, he's simultaneously showing how much of an asset he is with numbers. Like how great he was, how perfect he was for his job that he just got let go from because of, reasons. And so that's a way to really, I feel like, show the dignity that the character gets to keep as far as this goes on. And as far as it kind of becoming full circle, where we have the moment where Roma essentially becomes Shelley in this moment towards Williamson, where we kind of get put on equal ground, where the movie begins with Demi Moore basically being in this position of power as Tucci's let go, and they have this altercation. And then their last scene together is in this room where Demi Moore is now in the same position. And I also love the fact that it puts them on equal enough ground. Like, it gives them a human moment when they're talking to each other, and she mentions, like, you have kids, don't you? And it's like, this is kind of the first time we see her interacting with him as not in her position of power. But then they still have this moment of reality that sets in. Where it's like, that's a great thing to have this human moment together and to feel like you're on equal ground. And then it's like, well, hold on, not so fast. So Tucci seems to imply that her package will be significantly bigger and better than his. In this very sort of... I guess it's somewhat of a fuck you way, but it's also in they're still just kind of embracing, like, we're in the same boat. Maybe not completely, but... This is what it is, like, and this is the point that we come to, and like we were saying, this will be forever the vicious circle. Not to mention the way Demi Moore so coldly says, it better be, in response to the package being big and significant. So talking about as far as like the new coming in, and things being a bit more cutthroat as it goes on, the Simon Baker character plays an interesting part here, because obviously he's the one that's safe once Demi Moore has been let go. And the way they talk about how Simon Baker's 43, his character's 43, but he might as well be a child given the position that he has. So the idea of not only him being in this position, but like I said, the sort of cutthroat nature that has to come to it. A really great scene here is... We've been watching Penn Badgley's character hanging out with Zachary Quinto for the whole movie, and he's one of those characters that's, he's young, and he's, making a shitload of money, and he's living up this life, and he's basically living up the life he always kind of dreamed of. Those people that watch, like, The Wolf of Wall Street, and then hopefully hope that that's their life. And he's obsessed with how much everybody makes. Like, he's always saying, like, how much, do you think they made? And, hey, Paul Bettany told me how much he made last year. Do you want to guess what it is? And then when we see this moment when he breaks down learning that he's not going to make it out of this, and we see how he has that obsession with sort of status, it seems, and how he's completely off this ladder now. And so we have this human moment where he's in the bathroom stall crying, and he comes out and Simon Baker's just there shaving, just going about, the next piece of business. And there's that moment when he says, this is all I ever wanted to do. After he tells Simon Baker, like, I know you're probably going to fire me now. I heard that's what it's happening. And he seems surprised, like, really, this is what you always wanted to do. And then it's like he takes it in. And then there's this great moment where the camera lingers on Simon Baker after Penn Badgley leaves. And he goes back to shaving, and there's this question that you have of, did that sink in at all? Like, did he have a human moment there that's sticking? Or did he forget about Penn Badgley the second he walked out the door? And I like that seems to be a bit ambiguous in that moment. But I'm thinking the message here is that he essentially forgot about him when he walked out the door, because the next piece of business is going to come around, and how he got in this position is and he's just going to stay that way. And that's how he got in, because we're going to get more into that with Jeremy Irons. I didn't want to get ahead of myself about this idea of getting in a certain position because you're able to make the decisions that nobody else wants to make. And you can do it concisely and without emotion, and how much that's going to play a part in the power dynamic that's been going on here. So what I was saying about Williamson being one of these sort of pillars whose job is basically safe, and he has sort of the power to control these people underneath him, we can talk about those characters also, on top of Williamson, that I guess would also be Spacey again in Margin Call, as well as Paul Bettany. So to go down this path, as far as Williamson goes, there's obviously going to be much more humanity in the Spacey and Bettany characters in Margin Call, because I believe Williamson is essentially designed to be the antagonist of Glengarry Glen Ross, and what's interesting about that is they do play into this interesting dynamic with Williamson, where he does feel like he's constantly at odds with everybody there, and there's certainly, like, they treat him a certain way and he treats them a certain way, and there's just kind of been this mutual back and forth of hatred between him and everybody else. But the thing about it is, they set up what could be this sliver of humanity in Williamson, the idea of people having different sides between work and their outside life. And so Williamson makes many references to the fact that he's just trying to get home to be with his kids for the night and not having to deal with stuff like this. And like I said, while it does seem like he treats them rather unfairly, it is this idea of Williamson being maybe a good guy at heart. If he's the kind of guy that wants to get home and be with his kids, maybe there's, some form of humanity in here. But then the way this dynamic changes when we get to the end, and it turns out that he did go home and he was with his kids, but that also kind of ended up being the catalyst for what happens here, as far as Shelley getting caught. And when Shelley's trying to talk his way out of this, and he says, like, why are you doing this? Why won't you help me? Williamson really coldly says, because I don't like you. And despite knowing Shelley's whole situation, where even Shelley says, but, my sick daughter, I need help for my sick daughter, and Williamson essentially says, fuck you, I don't care. And so that changes that seems like the whole thing of, where is Williamson coming from in regards to his cynicism, and it's like, is he a more sort of softer, tender person at home when he's with his kids, or is he just as cutthroat at home, and is it maybe going on to his kids is just some sort of excuse or something like that? And I like that knowing that and also not knowing that about Williamson kind of makes him this sort of vague character in a good way. Usually that would be, especially if we're dealing with like an antagonist here, that would be sort of frustrating. But I think I like the fact it does feel like we are dealing with, because when you look at the people in Margin Call and the people in Glengarry Glen Ross, obviously you can say that Glengarry Glen Ross feels much more heightened in general, and much more dramatized about what it's talking about. But when you look at these little human elements that they give us, and they kind of insert into the characters here, even people like Williamson, it still gives you something to chew on about the character, which I really like. And the fact that you can wonder where exactly it is that he comes from, and what motivates him to be the way that he is, and cause the disruption that he does, and basically sabotage all of these guys in his own way. It's also just interesting in general to watch Spacey's performance here, especially since it's so much of him talking down to Jack Lemmon and knowing that Jack Lemmon was like his acting hero. So this was like basically like the pinnacle for Spacey as an actor, was doing these scenes with Lemmon. And then the fact that Spacey would basically be launched into the stratosphere shortly after this, and win his 2 Oscars and become super famous, before everything else. But that aside, it is, and continuing to push that aside, we're going to have to praise Spacey again, because what's interesting about looking at these 2 characters and how they sort of seem to have similar positions here as far as their power goes, the fact that Williamson is this really sort of cynical antagonist, and Sam in Margin Call has much more humanity about him. Where he's still in the position of power, and there's still the little details thrown in there of, is this somebody that's, completely qualified for his job or earned his job or whatever. But because, he's one of those people that'll walk in and Zachary Quinto's talking about, what's going on and how major this is and how this could wreck everything. And he looks at it and he says, I can't fucking read this. And so it's just that continues that theme of the people in power maybe not knowing near as much. What essentially seems to be the implication here is that the people in power here pretty much only have as much understanding of this as the average viewer. But we'll get into, especially when we get to the Iron stuff, we'll talk about where that comes in. But talking about Spacey's character in Margin Call, where we do open up with him being very distraught because his dog is dying. And so that immediately you immediately know that means this character has some sort of humanity in him, which is essentially screenwriting 101. But to see how that probably sort of changes his perspective through this whole outcome, and it's like, it kind of feels like maybe we don't have a clear picture of how he usually works in the office and how he usually treats subordinates or whatever, because this whole situation of his dog dying is basically he's in a completely different place than when he probably normally is, that we do not see, because it would be outside of the confines of this movie. But in the way that he's also the one that kind of sort of struggles to get on board the whole fire sale, there's definitely something where, like I said, when you look at what he does as Williamson versus what he does here, you can see that difference. And when you see the moments when he realizes that his son could be affected by what's going to happen here, and it's like, it could be this sense of, you might think there's a certain sort of soullessness to the fact that it takes so long for it to sink in. Oh yeah, I forgot I have loved ones that could be affected by this. But I think that's just more of the whole situation is so dire, and you get so caught up in what do we do about this and how do we do about that it just does take him naturally until the end of the movie to realize, oh shit, this could affect my son and my family. That feels like a very human moment to me, and not necessarily telling of Sam's character. And if anything, it does actually show a humanity that we don't really see in a lot of the other characters, as far as it affecting people outside of this office, really. So what's interesting, now that we've established that, what's interesting about Paul Bettany is, I feel like in this incredible ensemble, where once again everybody's on their A game, Paul Bettany has always been a real standout to me in this movie. And what I find really interesting about his character is the fact that, he's in this similar position, where he's not one of the higher-ups, but he's higher up than most of the people working here. They seem to find a place for his character that's sort of somewhere between Sam and Williamson, the 2 Spacey characters, where it seems like he's capable of Sam's humanity, but he's also just as capable of Williamson's cynicism and sort of the sense of ruthlessness. Because despite his position of power, we have these moments towards the beginning where he does feel human. Where like he has these interactions with Spacey, or the moments when he's at the bar and he has to be pulled back in. And it's like when we just kind of see him from a distance talking at the bar, you get that sense I was talking about, where it makes somebody feel like a real person when you see them in the work environment versus outside of the work environment. It's like, this guy's probably a totally different person in the office than he is outside of it. And he's a guy that's probably much more laid back and, whatever. And he's, once again, another one where he comes in, they try to explain it, and his response is, just simplify it so that I can understand it. And so he's on that same ground also. But we also get these moments when he walks in and he's slightly drunk and he says, you don't have to keep kissing my ass, there's no more cuts today. And so you get the sense that he could be that kind of guy. But then, once again, the dynamics change, especially when the stakes are set in, and things could get different. There's one scene, obviously, where the audience could probably view him in a very interesting way, which is the "fuck normal people" monologue, when he's essentially telling Penn Badgley that he's getting fired. And the idea that this probably would have sounded bad and made him sound like this really sort of Williamson-type character, this character that just doesn't care about, other people or people that are below him. Because we've learned that he made like $2.5 million last year. And it's one of those cases of, you think about the people that make this kind of money and significantly more, like billionaires even, and it's like, just, these people just live on another existence. These people just do not understand how the world works, how people work, how life works. They might as well be on another planet all their own, where everything just falls into place. And the way he seems to look down on people. But the thing about it is, that would be extremely off-putting for his character, but we've kind of already seen enough sides of him, and also just the writing in general and the movie itself has made this character well-rounded enough, and where we see where he's coming from. We've gotten enough inside his head, not completely, but enough inside his head, that we don't... I'm not saying that he's not, an arrogant prick, and it's not that he's, I'm not saying that his mind hasn't been warped by being a rich douchebag, but the movie makes us understand his outlook. Whereas, like I said, even if I'm not saying he's 100% right, morally and otherwise, but just it's enough that we just understand where he's coming from. We understand why he feels this way and why he would say that, and where this cynical perspective is coming from. And I feel like that's just really strong writing and character development in general, on top of Bettany's amazing performance. Because we also get that great moment when they're on the roof, and he has the dialogue about, people aren't afraid of falling, they're afraid of jumping. And he has this moment where he essentially cheats death. Where it's like, we get the sense that it crossed his mind to just end it right now, and then he has this celebratory moment that he didn't. But the idea that he might be capable of it, or maybe he's just still a little drunk from before. All of that. But like I said, it all adds this humanity to the character, where he doesn't just feel like it's not like a black or white thing. He's this very gray area sort of character. So as far as the characters with even more power, there's the Alec Baldwin and Jeremy Irons characters, both of which kind of come in and have their big sort of viral speech, as it goes, as we would talk about in today's age now. Like the Jeremy Irons clip, his first scene, like I remember I saw Margin Call when it first came out, and it was in the Oscar race, and it got that original screenplay nomination, and then it was like years later suddenly, like the Jeremy Irons scene went viral, and everybody was talking about it. And it makes me wonder how many people have seen the full movie versus just know that clip. But I'm assuming if that clip made enough of an impression, people sought out the movie, and the movie kind of gained a bit more popularity, which is great. Just on the basis of Irons' first scene alone. But before we talk about the Irons stuff, there's the Alec Baldwin scene. The scene it's just one scene. And what's great about this is not only is it just iconic and has been parodied over and over again, sometimes by Baldwin himself, the famous moment on Saturday Night Live where he's like getting elves to cobble shoes, and he's supposed to do always be cobbling and do the whole thing, but he was so used to the dialogue he was still saying always be closing in the elf sketch, which is fantastic. But the thing that's crazy about this is that the fact that this speech isn't in the play, and this character isn't in the play, and that he was written specifically for the movie. And what's interesting about that, and is a testament to not just the speech itself and Baldwin's performance, but the whole movie is so great. We've been talking about the strengths of the movie up to this point, and the amazing cast and the amazing scenes, and how the movie feels nonstop. But the fact that the movie in itself is that level of quality, but yet it's very hard to imagine the movie without this one scene. Like, that's the impact that it leaves. Not to mention, you would think, like, when you would see the Jeremy Irons scene, he's talking to a whole boardroom, and this is like, some big history-altering decisions that are being made. Baldwin's speech has the same impact, and he's talking to 3 people in a nearly empty room on a rainy night. And it's just 3 people. And a lot of it is him, once again, Ed Harris being dressed down again. And talking about that with Pacino and especially Baldwin, it's like, dressing down Ed Harris would not be an easy thing to do, because Ed Harris is intimidating in himself. And it's like, I love that moment where it's like, after Baldwin's had his speech and he's essentially left the room, then Ed Harris starts getting all tough. And it's like, that's the kind of character that Baldwin is, where he brings in that intimidation. And the great thing about it is, yeah, not only does he have this one great moment, but with the exception of him putting on his coat and walking out of the room, we just never see him again. But that just immediately became legendary. It immediately set the tone. It immediately sort of put these guys in this certain place. It's talking about how Ed Harris gets bent out of shape. A continuous thing between him and the detective with the unseen interrogations towards the end. Well, through the second half, really. It's another theme that these guys just get talked to in the most berating, degrading possible ways. And like I said, the fact that the Baldwin scene just really sets this tone with one legendary speech basically says everything. And like I said, it's crazy how you can almost not even imagine the whole story without it, yet somehow that's what the play has always been, which is really wild. And obviously that brings in the full ruthless nature, where I was talking about how Glengarry Glen Ross may not seem as capable of humanity as Margin Call, just because the idea is that it's, super dramatized and super heightened as far as the personalities go. The ruthlessness may be real, like I said, as far as, like, the humanity being in here, but moments like Baldwin's speech and stuff like that, where Alec Baldwin doesn't necessarily feel like one of those guys that, has a work life and then has a regular life. When he's talking about his possessions and his watch and his car and stuff like that, you just get the sense that this guy is an entity, and that's all he is to come in here and berate and degrade and be rich and successful by being ruthless. And that's this entire guy's being. With Irons, it's interesting because when he comes in, first of all, I love the way he's built up and the way he, like, comes in on the helicopter, and it's this big dramatic sort of introduction to the character, and now he has to live up to that intro. But if anybody's going to be able to live up to that, it would be Jeremy Irons. And the fact that not only is Jeremy Irons so legendary, but the fact that he has been so often underutilized in recent years. It was really amazing when this movie came out. It's like, to see Jeremy Irons really get to be like full peak Jeremy Irons is fantastic in both big ways and subtle ways and sort of more downplayed ways. And so, yeah, he comes in and he kind of sets us in with the speak to me as you would a young child or a golden retriever. So with that line, he's kind of setting himself up like, and he says, like, it wasn't brains that got me in this position. And when he says that line, I imagine a lot of people take it as he's essentially calling himself an idiot, and that he's basically doesn't have understanding of much of anything. And it's what we were talking about with Bettany's character, where it's like, the different world you live in when you're that rich, and then this guy is on another plane entirely. So the idea of him suggesting that, and like I said, we've seen that throughout, of both Spacey and Bettany saying, I don't understand these figures or these numbers or what anything means, and they need people like Zachary Quinto and Penn Badgley to tell them. But it's not exactly what it seems to imply there. Where we do have these moments where Irons does seem like he doesn't really know, but he has to have Zachary Quinto dumb everything down. But we do learn he has his whole be first, be smarter, or cheat speech, and he talks about, how does one end up in this position not knowing about, everything that goes on. And we learn very quickly that he's a guy that has basically gotten to this point because he's able to make those decisions concisely that nobody else will, what we talked about earlier. And how he's able to do that with this sort of. It's its own kind of ruthlessness, because we talked about the ruthlessness of Baldwin, who can essentially come in and just drop a bomb on you and say, I'm just gonna fuck you up and just leave it at that and just annihilate you and leave you in nothing but a pile of dust. Jeremy Irons' character will poison you and then sit there and rationally talk to you about why this had to happen and why you have to die, basically. Um, this scene with Demi Moore especially, when he lets her go and he talks about this, you don't like, she's trying to basically fight for herself, and she feels like she can kind of say, we knew about this and we tried to do something, and he just basically cuts her off and says, don't go down this path, like it's best if you just don't even try to save yourself. And he says it in such this way of, there's no fight. There's just no way around this. It's like, this is a guy where when he sits down in a room and he says something, especially if he says it calmly, like, the more calm he is, the more intimidating and final whatever he's saying is. I especially love the direction in that scene also, where when he tells Demi Moore essentially that she's being sacrificed, basically. Instead of like cutting back to him, the camera just lingers on her for a long time, and there are like these pauses between them where everything sets in, and that's the kind of power that he brings to this. Where, like I said, he has his moments where he's saying, like, this is it, that are like big moments, and he's making these big decisions. But like I said, I feel like the power comes even more when he says these things quietly and reserved, and like these are things that just have to happen. And like I said, like we were talking about the position of power and how he gets to that point, because he's the guy that can do that calmly and with no emotion whatsoever, and just say, this is big, this is life altering for people, this could ruin people, but it's just the way it is. And he can just say that with a totally straight face, and that's it. And then that's when you realize how some people get to their positions of power. So that's basically the extent of how much I want to talk about the characters. As far as just the writing itself, where I was saying how there's a lot of fast-talking characters and a lot of fast dialogue, something you would totally expect out of Mamet, and what Shandor's done with the dialogue here. But what I like about the idea of using sort of fast-paced dialogue is how differently it's used here, where like in Glengarry Glen Ross, it's this idea of the more fast-talking somebody is, the more bullshit you're probably hearing or is probably being peddled to you. But it's also the way they sort of play on each other in that way. Like we were talking about using salesman tactics in like their regular interactions. Like one thing that I always thought was brilliantly done from a writing standpoint was the Moss character and how he's handled with Alan Arkin's character, where Ed Harris's performance for a lot of this movie is like ranting and raving, and it seems like he's venting out all of his frustrations, and it's just kind of Alan Arkin sort of agreeing and nodding. And while that just kind of seems like he's sort of, just going on and just sort of bitching and complaining and all that, it does seem like it's this perfect build-up once the story is revealed of where this is going with Moss's character, where he's like, it was all build up to him starting the break-in, like starting the idea of it, and this idea of recruiting Alan Arkin, and this whole, as he's been ranting and raving, it's like he's been using his skills as a salesman to sell Arkin on the idea of breaking in. And I love that using the salesman tactics for these sort of greedy means also that are outside of the job itself is something that's really fascinating to me, and the way they use that. But as far as people, doing the fast-talking thing in Margin Call, it kind of feels like it's more of one of those things of the characters talk fast just to try to fit it into a reasonable runtime. Because if they just kind of spoke normally, this movie would be like 5 hours long. But also that idea of asking, like, when they ask Zachary Quinto for his background at the board meeting, at the emergency meeting, and when he answers, it essentially sounds like another language. And so it kind of puts us in that position of, and it helps a lot to have the higher ups there, where not only is it, a testament to how much the higher ups may not understand about the intricacies of what's going on here, but kind of putting us as the audience in that position also, where when we hear that, it is like we get that same experience of not understanding exactly what's going on, but being able to use the context of the movie and how the movie can feel realistic because they're not constantly dumbing it down except for the characters that ask for it. But there's still enough structure in the story itself and the way the characters react and play off everything that the story is still told without us being slowed down by us maybe not understanding all the dialogue, which is really well done. I love the fact that they didn't really, dumb it down completely and make the characters talk like, to where the higher ups need to understand it. And that just wasn't the whole dialogue so that the audience could understand it. And the way they balanced that without it feeling too blatant when they would translate is so well done. And what I especially like about Margin Call is how it kind of comes away from that a little bit. Like, with Mammoth, you're going to get non-stop dialogue until the very end. And with Margin Call, while the dialogue still does feel relatively non-stop, we have these moments like in the scene between Demi Moore and Irons, where I said there's those pauses in between, where those moments where the camera just kind of lingers on them as we understand what's kind of going through their minds. And what I like about those pauses in the dialogue is it's like the more they happen, the more it's intentionally moving away from the speed of movie dialogue. So it's almost like when the dialogue slows down and starts to have more pauses in it, is reality setting in. And it's like we're kind of getting away from the movie aspect, and it's like, oh no, this is actually a very real thing. We kind of get that in the scene with Demi Moore and Tucci as well. And all that is... Yeah, it's very easy to see why this movie was nominated an original screenplay. The question now is why it didn't win. But because it's very, very strong, and it gets stronger the more you see it and look at it. But as far as the atmosphere, I guess is where I want to kind of close this out, I suppose. That both of these movies are mostly set at night and then bleed into the next morning. With all these characters having probably not slept at all. Certainly not in Margin Call. Probably not much in Glengarry Glen Ross either. And what I love about this, to go back to Glengarry Glen Ross, is the idea of it being a play adapted to screen. And that's something where people can talk about it, potentially suffering. I honestly... Because there's always the criticism that something can feel like a filmed play, but that's something that's never really bothered me that much, when you can kind of tell a movie was a play at one point. It helps a lot to sort of, tweak the atmosphere a little bit and make it feel a bit more cinematic. But as far as it, being dialogue-driven and performance-driven, it's still really well done. And I love the idea of the rainy sort of atmosphere, and the way they use that, where it's, not just does it, put this whole dreary feel onto it, but, or it's like, rain can also be seen as like this sort of relaxing thing, like it's kind of a relaxing, lulling sort of sound. And the fact that everything that's happening in this movie is so intense and the stakes feel so high. And you would get moments like, symbolic moments, like when Jack Lemmon's leaving Bruce Altman's house, and he gets rejected, and he has to basically walk out into the rain as he's dejected. It might be a little on the nose, but I feel like it's effective. And I love the fact also that this movie is basically split right at the halfway point. Where, like, the movie is 100 minutes, and pretty much right at the 50-minute mark is when the next morning comes. And I love that it's split pretty much exactly down the middle between night and day. And like I said, the way they utilize that, where it feels like when Shelley comes in the next day, and it's like there's this new ray of hope, despite the fact that the break-in has now happened, and how that's not the case. The dread of the previous rainy night is still going to be here and still going to come back in, and the effects are still going to be here. Now, as far as Margin Call kind of having this sort of night owl feel, I guess you could call it, where we get a lot of glimpses of just the night sky and the quiet, and because there's a start of it where Quinto and Badgley are kind of driving around looking for Tucci at this point, and they're just kind of looking around and saying, like, these people have no idea what's about to happen, and like this knowledge is just weighing on them the way it was with Eric at the beginning of the movie. But when it gets into like the dead of night, when we go further, it does feel like some of the most real shit goes down in the dead of night. And so to see this happen, where it's like we're seeing it's a weird comparison, but like what happens in Dark City, when like everything kind of stops at a certain time of night, and then all of the sort of the shadow people come in and make all the mechanics happen while everybody's like out of it, and then everything goes back to normal. It shows like the idea of talking about the power that these characters have, and the idea of like when they're on the roof and they're looking down and they feel so far away from the world, is symbolic in itself, and it's like where it's almost like this godlike perspective, as gross as that is to say, as they're looking down and just know the chaos that's about to happen in this very quiet, like outlook. And then, in the way we keep getting glimpses of that, especially through windows, like in the big iron scene when he's standing at the window and we get a nice shot from there, or the scene with him and Spacey a little later. I just love the way the night is used as an environment in itself, where it feels like all of this is happening behind one giant closed door, while we're able to see from a distance everybody and everything that's about to be impacted by this. And it's so well done, and that's pretty much, I think, all I have to say as far as these two movies go. So as far as me preferring one to the other, maybe a little while ago I might have been able to say that it's kind of impossible to pick, but the thing about it is Glengarry Glen Ross has always been great, and you know, some people might say that, you know, the play and the movie could potentially be Mamet's masterpiece. Certainly up there with his great work, his greatest work. But the thing about it is, as much as I love Glengarry Glen Ross and the writing and the character dynamic and the performances, and then it feels like a thriller, and just everything about it, front to back, it does feel like the same movie every time I come back to it. Like, there's not really anything that catches me off guard, like, oh, I didn't see that before, or oh, this didn't really hit me before. It's always the same movie when I come back to it, which is great, because I love the movie that it is, and everything about it. But the more I watch Margin Call, it just seems to get clearer and clearer just how good it is. Like, there's always something that seems to escape me of, oh, no, Margin Call is great. And then the next time it's like, oh, I know it's great, but I didn't realize how great. And then that happens, like, every time I watch it. Whether it be the writing or the performances or the direction or whatever. It just seems like it's almost a new experience every time, even though I know the directions it's going. I know which characters are fucked and which characters are fine. Which ones are getting promoted, which ones are going to be much worse off. But I don't know, just it feels like it hits different almost every single time. And so that would probably leave me coming back to Margin Call more, or having more satisfying rewatches. But that's not to say I don't love Glengarry Glen Ross front to back and won't watch it a million times over still. So that's how I feel about these two. So the next thing is going to be another retrospective. We're going to go back and talk about a movie that I kind of bashed before that I feel differently about now. And then I think we've got a couple more verses after that, and then we'll get into like award stuff, and Owen has something coming out, and more of this, more of a lot of stuff like this, and reviews and stuff like that. And then October stuff is a whole bunch of fun stuff. So until all of that, I think that's it.